Agnes Calloway pressed the rifle barrel against Cole Harrington's chest before he finished climbing off his horse. Not aimed at him, against him, close enough that he could feel the cold metal through his coat. "My husband is buried 40 yards from where you're standing," she said. Snow driving sideways between them, temperature dropping fast. 5 children on the other side of that door. "He died trying to build something for this family. You are not taking it. Not today. Not in 3 days. Not ever." Cole looked down at the rifle, then up at her. He didn't step back. "Before we go any further, stay with us until the very end, because what happens between this iron-willed widow and the coldest man in Montana Territory in the worst blizzard of 1889 will change how you think about second chances. Drop a comment right now, telling me what city or state you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories reach. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel, please do it now. Now let's go back to where the story really begins. The letter had arrived in October, 3 weeks after Will Calloway took his last breath. Agnes had been in the barn when the banker's boy rode up. She'd been on her knees in the hay, her hands inside a calf that wouldn't turn right. And she'd told the boy to leave whatever he had on the porch, and she'd get to it when she could. She'd gotten to it 2 hours later, after the calf was breathing and the mother was calm, and Agnes had washed the blood from her arms in the ice-cold creek behind the house. She'd read it standing at the kitchen table, read it twice, then folded it exactly the way it had come and set it next to the salt cellar and started making supper. $650. Will had borrowed it 18 months ago, signed the deed to their 180 acres as collateral. Never said a word about it. He'd been planning to pay it back before she found out. She was certain of that, because Will had been the kind of man who carried his failures in silence, convinced he could fix them quietly before anyone noticed the weight he was under. She understood now why the last year had been so hard on him. It hadn't just been the sickness. The deadline on the loan was December 1st. December 1st had come and gone 19 days ago. Agnes had written a letter to Cole Harrington's office in Billings, explaining the situation and asking for an extension. She'd received no response. She'd written a second letter. Still nothing. She'd told herself he was busy. She'd told herself reasonable men existed in the world, and she would find one when she needed to. Then this morning, Ruth had called from the window in that careful voice she used when she was trying not to frighten the little ones. "Mama, men coming through the North Pass." Agnes had looked out and seen 3 riders coming through a wall of white. The blizzard that had been threatening since dawn had arrived in full force an hour earlier, killing visibility, dropping the temperature to something that bit through wool like it wasn't there. Sensible men didn't ride in this. Men who rode in this were either desperate or certain of their authority. She'd taken Will's rifle from above the door, checked the load, walked out. She'd meant to stop them at the property line. She hadn't expected the lead rider to keep coming. Cole Harrington had reined his horse to a stop when the rifle came up, but he hadn't backed away. He'd looked at her across 20 feet of driving snow, with gray eyes that registered the gun the way a man registers weather. Something to be accounted for, nothing to be afraid of. Then he'd started to dismount, and Agnes had moved before she'd thought it through, closed the distance in 6 steps, and put the barrel against his chest while he was still halfway off the horse. She felt him go still. "Mrs. Calloway." His voice was even, no fear in it, no anger either, which was somehow worse. "I'd appreciate it if you'd lower that. I'd appreciate it if you'd state your business from horseback and then ride back the way you came. You know my business. I know what you think your business is. I'm telling you it isn't." For a moment, neither of them moved. Snow collecting on the brim of his hat, steam from the horse's breath. Behind her, not a sound from the house, which meant the children were listening through the walls. holding themselves quiet the way they'd learned to do in the months since Will died, reading the temperature of every situation before deciding how to react. Then Cole Harrington looked down at the rifle barrel pressing into his coat, and something shifted in his expression. Not softness, something more like recognition. "My husband is buried 40 yards from where you're standing," Agnes said. "He died trying to build something for this family. You are not taking it. Not today, not in 3 days, not ever." "That's not your decision to make, ma'am. The law—" "Don't talk to me about the law." She said it quietly, which was more dangerous than saying it loud, and something in his eyes told her he understood the difference. "The law is a piece of paper your lawyers wrote. My children are real. This land is real. Will is real. Right there under that oak tree. And I swear to God I will make this the hardest piece of property you have ever tried to take, before I let you walk away with it." The older ranch hand behind Cole, weathered man, somewhere around 50, had the look of someone who'd spent 30 years watching his boss make decisions. Made a sound that might have been a cough, and might have been something else entirely. Cole Harrington stepped back from the rifle. Not because he was afraid of it, because he'd chosen to. "Come inside," he said. "If we're going to have this conversation, we're going to have it out of the weather." Agnes lowered the rifle. She didn't put it down. "My children are in that house." "I'm not here to frighten children, Mrs. Calloway." She looked at him for a long moment, at the gray eyes and the hard jaw and the set of his shoulders that said this man had not changed his mind about anything quickly in a very long time. "Wipe your boots," she said, and turned and walked back to the house. The inside stopped Cole harder than the cold had. Not the warmth, though after 3 hours in a Montana December, the heat from the iron stove hit like a physical thing. Something else. The smell of it. Wood smoke and soup and bread, and underneath that, the particular density of a space where people lived close together and loved each other in the specific, worn-down daily way that came from having nothing extra and choosing to stay anyway. The table was set for 6. Mismatched plates, mismatched chairs, a crack in the far wall stuffed with rags against the wind. The children were lined up near the back wall. Cole had known there were 5. He hadn't known what 5 would look like standing in a row, watching him come through the door. The oldest was a girl, 10 or so, dark-haired and straight-backed, holding a battered notebook flat against her chest the way a soldier holds a shield. Her eyes found Cole and stayed there. Calm. Measuring. Older than any 10-year-old's eyes had a right to be. Next to her, a boy, 8 maybe, wearing a hat 2 sizes too big, the brim bent up in the front where he'd probably bent it himself. His jaw was set in a way that said he'd already made his decision about Cole, and it wasn't favorable, and he wanted Cole to know it. Beside the boy, a smaller girl with 2 braids and a 3-legged stuffed cat tucked under one arm, watching Cole with open, uncomplicated curiosity, the way children watch something before they've decided to be careful. Behind the older girl, barely visible, a tiny face. 4 years old, maybe less. Brown eyes enormous. She didn't run. She didn't speak. She just watched. And in Agnes's arms, a baby. 18 months, red-cheeked from the cold, both fists stuffed in his mouth. Apparently the only person in the room unbothered by anything. "Ruth," Agnes said, and her voice had changed, dropped into something softer and more private. "Take your brothers and sisters to the back room, please." The oldest girl moved immediately, efficient, practiced, started gathering the smaller ones with the quiet authority of a child who'd been second in command for a long time. The boy didn't move. "Henry," Agnes said it gently, "I want to hear." He said it to Agnes, but he was looking at Cole when he said it. "I know." He came to take our house. I want to hear what he says about it." Cole looked at the boy, at the oversized hat and the compressed jaw, and the grief that was living just underneath the defiance, hot and recent, the kind that hadn't figured out yet whether it was going to become anger or something else. "Listen to your mother," Cole said. Henry stared at him. 1 second. 2. Then turned and walked to the back room, feet heavy on the floorboards, deliberate, making sure the weight of each step was heard. The door closed. Agnes set the baby on her hip and sat down across the table from Cole, without invitation or ceremony, and looked at him with those steady brown eyes. "Here is what I know," she said. "I have $63, 2 milk cows, 14 chickens, a root cellar that will last through February if we're careful, and 40 acres of winter wheat, Will planted in October before he got too sick to finish." She held his gaze. "Come March, that wheat pays this debt in full, with interest to spare. So the question is not whether I can pay you, Mr. Harrington. The question is whether you are the kind of man who can wait 8 weeks. "The contract. My husband signed a contract, yes. My husband also died without telling me about it, which puts me in the position of honoring a promise I didn't make." She didn't say it as a complaint, just a fact, the way she'd have reported the weather. "I'm not asking you to forget what you're owed. I'm asking for 8 weeks, 60 days. That's all." Cole set his hands flat on the table. He'd heard this story before, not from her, but from people in her position, always with a harvest coming, always with a payment just around the next season's corner. He'd extended grace before. He'd learned what it cost. 60 days becomes 90, he said. 90 becomes a year. I have had this exact conversation, Mrs. Calloway, more times than I can count. With women who had 5 children and a dead husband's wheat under 4 feet of snow? With people who were desperate and convincing and genuinely believed what they were saying. And were they wrong, every one of them? Cole didn't answer. "Tell me what you need to believe me," Agnes said. "Not a speech, not my word. What proof? What collateral? What condition? Tell me the terms that make this work for you, and I will meet them." He looked at her. The directness of her was startling. No performance in it, no attempt to seem pitiful, no manufactured tears. She was negotiating with him like a business equal, and she knew it, and she didn't apologize for it. "I'd need to see the wheat," he said slowly. "Inspect the fields myself. Satisfy that what you're describing exists and is viable." "You can look tomorrow, at first light." "I'd need a new contract. Signed, witnessed, filed with the county clerk. Everything documented properly." "I'll sign whatever you need." "And if the wheat fails? Late thaw, early blight, any act of God or otherwise? The deed reverts immediately. No further extension, no appeal." Agnes was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "Agreed," she said. The baby on her hip reached out suddenly, both arms, directly toward Cole, the way babies reached for things before they understood that some things weren't theirs to grab. Agnes caught him before he could lean too far, pulled him back against her, and Thomas made a sound of mild protest and settled, one small fist closing around the collar of his mother's dress. Cole looked away. 60 days, he said. He heard his own voice say it, and understood, distantly, that something had just happened that he hadn't fully consented to. "You have until the 1st of February, not 1 day past." Agnes let out a breath. One breath, controlled, quick, and then she was steady again. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. This is not charity. This is a business decision, with specific terms that I will hold you to, absolutely." "I understand that." "I mean it, Mrs. Calloway. If you are 1 day late—" "I heard you the first time." She met his eyes. I don't need you to say it twice." The back room door had come open a crack. Cole saw it in his peripheral vision. The small face again, the 4-year-old, Nora, watching through the gap with those huge brown eyes. She'd been there for a while, he realized. She'd been there since before the baby reached for him. "Your youngest has been standing there for 10 minutes, Cole said. Agnes glanced at the door. Something crossed her face that wasn't quite a smile, but carried the same warmth. "She decides about people before she'll show herself. Took her 3 weeks to come out from behind my skirt after Will died." A pause. "She hasn't run." Cole stood up, put his hat back on. "I'll need a place to wait out the storm," he said. "My men, too. I won't ask you to take us into the house." "I have a barn. Warmer than you'd think." She stood, with the baby still on her hip. "Henry will bring blankets." "I appreciate it." He walked to the door, hand on the latch. He didn't know why he stopped. "The wheat," he said, not turning around. "Will planted it before he knew he was dying. Or after." A silence behind him that lasted just long enough to mean something. "After," Agnes said quietly. "He knew by September. He planted in October anyway. Said the children would need something to come up in the spring." Cole opened the door and walked out into the white. Wade pulled his horse alongside the moment Cole was clear of the porch, reading his face the way he'd been reading it for 16 years. "Well," Wade said, "don't. 2 months is a long time, boss." "I'm aware. Storm like this, we might be here a day or two regardless." "I'm aware of that too." Wade was quiet for 20 steps. Then, "She's not going to be able to harvest that wheat alone." "That's not my problem." "No," Wade said. "Reckon it isn't." He said it in the tone of a man who meant the exact opposite. The barn was warm with animal heat, smelling of hay and horses. 2 milk cows regarding them from their stalls with a patient indifference of creatures that had seen worse than strangers. Cole hung the lantern on its hook and unsaddled his horse without speaking. Carson, 23 years old and unburdened by the wisdom that came from being wrong enough times, spread his bedroll in the corner and said, "She can't pay it. Spring wheat in Montana is a gamble even in a good year. You know that." "I know it." "So why the 60 days?" Cole didn't answer. Outside, the storm had settled into its full weight, wind driving hard against the barn walls, finding every gap and whispering through it. In the house, a lamp burned in the window. One light in all that dark and snow. Cole lay back on the cold barn floor and stared up at the rafters and did not think about Eleanor. He'd made a rule about that. He didn't let himself use the past to justify the present. Whatever had happened 7 years ago was his to carry, not to wield as a reason for every hard decision that came after. He thought instead about a man named Will Calloway, planting 40 acres of winter wheat in October, already sick, knowing what was coming, putting seeds in frozen ground because he needed something to come up in the spring, for children who would still be there after he wasn't. That was either the most foolish thing Cole had ever heard of, or the bravest. He wasn't sure yet which. Across the yard, Agnes Calloway's lamp burned on through the storm, steady and small, against everything trying to put it out. Cole watched it through the gap in the barn door until his eyes grew heavy. It was still burning when he finally slept. Cole woke before dawn to the sound of an axe. He lay still for a moment, listening. Rhythmic, steady, coming from the direction of the woodpile behind the house. He checked his watch in the thin gray light coming through the barn door. 4:47 in the morning. The storm had blown itself out sometime in the night, leaving the world outside silent and white and brutal with cold. He pulled on his coat and boots and walked out. Agnes was at the woodpile in the dark, splitting firewood by lantern light. She was wearing a man's coat over her dress, too large in the shoulders, sleeves rolled back, and she was working with the focused efficiency of someone doing a job they'd done 1,000 times, not thinking about it anymore, just doing it. The axe came down clean. The log split. She set the next one without looking up. Cole stood in the barn doorway and watched her for a moment. Thought about going back inside. He walked over instead. She heard his boots on the frozen ground and glanced up without stopping. "Mr. Harrington." "Mrs. Calloway." "Storm's done." She split another log. "Roads into town will be passable by mid-morning if you want to get an early start." "I told you I'd look at the wheat fields. I keep my word." She paused just long enough to tell him she hadn't been sure about that. Then she set another log on the block. "I'll take you out after breakfast." "Let me." He held out his hand for the axe. She looked at his hand, then at his face. Her expression said she was deciding whether this was an insult or an offer. "I know you don't need it. I'm offering." He kept his hand out. "I've got nothing else to do for the next 2 hours, and you've got 5 children to feed breakfast to. Seems like a reasonable division of labor." A silence between them, frost cold and still. She handed him the axe. He worked for an hour straight, splitting the pile she'd started and then the logs stacked against the barn wall that hadn't been touched yet, working until the wood pile beside the porch was stacked shoulder high, and his shoulders were burning and his breath came in hard white clouds in the freezing air. It was good work, honest work. The kind that didn't leave room for thinking about anything except the weight of the axe and the grain of the wood. He was stacking the last of it when Henry appeared on the porch. The boy stood with his arms crossed, and Will's oversized hat pulled low, watching Cole the way a sentry watches an enemy perimeter. He had a mug in each hand, steam rising from both. Cole straightened up, set the axe against the fence post. "Mama said to bring you coffee," Henry said. He walked down the porch steps and held out one of the mugs without moving any closer, extending his arm to cover the distance so he wouldn't have to. Cole crossed the distance himself, took the mug. "Thank you." Henry pulled his own mug back against his chest and didn't leave. "You split all of that," the boy said. It wasn't a question or a compliment. It was the tone of someone updating their understanding of a situation. "Seemed like it needed doing." "We had enough wood." "You had enough for a week. Now you have enough for 3. Henry drank his coffee and said nothing. Cole drank his and watched the sky go from black to the particular dark blue that came just before dawn in Montana. The color that meant the cold was about to get worse before the sun could do anything about it. "My papa used to do that," Henry said finally. "Get up before anybody else and do the work that needed doing before we woke up. So it'd just be done when we came outside." He stopped, drank again. He did it so Mama wouldn't have to. Cole said nothing. "She's been doing it herself since October," Henry said. "Every morning. Gets up before us and does it herself so we don't see how hard it is." The boy's jaw worked. "I see, though. I always see." "I know you do," Cole said. Henry looked at him directly for the first time. Straight brown eyes under that ridiculous hat brim, and in them something that was not the hostility Cole had expected, but something rawer and more complicated. A boy trying to figure out how to be the man of a house that had a man in it as recently as October, doing the math of what he was supposed to be now, and coming up short every time. "I'm not trying to take your house," Cole said quietly. "I'm here because your father signed a legal document, and the law requires me to act on it. That's the truth of why I rode out here. But your mother convinced me to wait until the wheat comes in." He paused. "I'm going to look at the fields this morning and make sure the crop is what she says it is. If it is, your family has 60 days. And if it isn't?" Cole looked at the boy. didn't soften the answer. Then we'll have a harder conversation. Henry absorbed that the way his mother absorbed hard information, without flinching, just adjusting. "It's there," he said. "The wheat. I helped Papa plant it. Every row." Something moved through his face, quick and painful, gone before Cole could name it. "It's there." The back door opened, and Agnes leaned out, one hand on the frame, Ruth visible behind her, managing a skillet with the calm competence of a child who'd been cooking for 2 years. "Henry, breakfast." Henry turned to go, stopped with one foot on the porch step. "Mr. Harrington." He didn't look back. "Mama takes her coffee with sugar when we have it. We have some. I thought you should know." Then he went inside. Cole stood in the cold with the empty mug in his hand and the sky going pale at the edges, and didn't examine too closely why a small thing like that had landed the way it did. The wheat fields were everything Agnes had said they were. Cole walked the rows with her in the brutal morning cold, both of them moving through snow that came to their knees in places, and he looked at what Will Calloway had put in the ground in October, knowing he was dying. 40 acres, planted clean and straight, winter wheat varieties that could take the cold and come up hard in the spring thaw. He crouched down and dug through the snow with his gloved hand until he found the stubble of stalks below and broke one off, split it with his thumbnail, looked at what was inside. Good seed, good soil prep. Will had known what he was doing. "It's viable," Cole said, standing up. Agnes had been waiting 3 steps back, letting him look without hovering, which told him she was confident about what he'd find. "I know it is." "You'll need help harvesting. You understand that. 40 acres is more than you can bring in alone." "I'll hire day labor from town when the time comes." "With what money? You told me you had $63. "I'll have more by then. I'm taking in sewing. Mrs. Morrison in town has already sent work, and Dot McAllister said she'd spread the word to the ranches east of here." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm not sitting still for 60 days, Mr. Harrington. I'm working every hour I have." Cole looked out across the field, snow-covered, silent, 40 acres of what a dying man had believed in enough to plant anyway. "He was a good farmer," he said. Agnes was quiet for a moment. "He was a good man who wanted to be a better farmer. There's a difference." She said it the way she'd said everything, without bitterness, just the precise shape of the truth as she understood it. "He had big ideas, and not always the skill to match them. But he worked hard, and he loved this land, and he loved his children, and when he knew he was going, he put everything he had left into the ground so they'd have something in the spring." She looked at the field. "That's not nothing." "No," Cole said. "It's not." They walked back through the snow in silence that had changed quality from the silences of the day before, less like 2 people braced against each other, and more like 2 people standing on the same cold ground, looking at the same difficult thing. It was Wade who broke the day open. He came riding fast from the North Road around noon, when Cole was in the barn checking his horse's shoes, and Agnes was inside putting Nora down for a nap. Wade came in hard through the barn door, already talking before he'd fully stopped. "Decker Hoyle was in town this morning." Cole set down the horse's hoof. "And?" "He knows you're out here, knows you gave the widow an extension." Wade's face was tight in the way it got when he had information he didn't like delivering. "He was at the saloon telling anyone who'd listen that you've gone soft. Said if you won't enforce the contract, he'll find a way to enforce it himself." Hoyle has no legal standing on this property. He has a cousin on the county land board, and he's been buying up notes on 3 other properties in this valley, all of them distressed, all of them using the same approach. He gets the debt, he gets the land, He controls the water rights on the South Fork by Spring. Wade paused.
He's been after this particular piece for 2 years, boss. The spring-fed creek that runs through the Calloway property is the last piece he needs to cut off access for the Hendricks and the Pruitt operations. Once he owns that water, he owns this whole end of the valley.
Cole was still for a moment. Hoyle knew about Will Calloway's loan?
He knew. Word is, he was the one who suggested to Will that your operation was the place to go for quick money. Set it up so Will would come to you, knowing Will couldn't pay, knowing the deadline would come due in winter when a widow would be most vulnerable.
Wade looked at him.
You was supposed to foreclose in December and flip the deed to Hoyle by January. That was the plan he was counting on.
The cold in the barn had nothing to do with the temperature.
He used me, Cole said.
He used the system. You were just the mechanism he picked. Wade pulled his hat off, turned it in his hands.
The widow doesn't know any of this.
She thinks this is just about the debt. Cole walked to the barn door and looked at the house. Smoke from the chimney, thin and steady against the white sky. Through the window, he could see Ruth moving in the kitchen, the small shapes of the younger children somewhere behind her.
"What does Hoyle intend to do?" he said.
"Don't know exactly, but a man who'll set up a widow and 5 children as a mechanism to acquire water rights isn't going to walk away just because you gave her 60 days. Agnes appeared in the back doorway of the house, shaking a rag rug, not looking toward the barn, unaware of everything that had just been laid on the table between 2 men 20 yards away. She shook the rug twice, sharp, efficient snaps, and went back inside. Cole made a decision the way he usually made them, quickly and without consulting the part of himself that knew it was going to complicate his life. "Don't say anything to her yet.
Not until I know more about what Hoyle is actually planning."
"And what are you planning?" "I'm going to ride into town tomorrow morning and have a conversation with Decker Hoyle." Wade put his hat back on. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where he understands that whatever arrangement he thought he'd set up has changed." The afternoon went the way the morning had. Cole finding tasks around the property that needed doing, fence posts loose from the freeze-thaw cycles, a section of the chicken coop roof that had partially collapsed under the snow's weight, a hinge on the root cellar door that had rusted through and left it not closing cleanly, which meant cold getting into the family's food supply. He worked because the work was there, and because standing still left room for thoughts he didn't want to have yet. Clara found him at the chicken coop.
She came around the corner of the house with her 3-legged stuffed cat under her arm and stopped 3 feet from him and watched him nail the roof board back into place with the frank, evaluating stare that was apparently her default setting for everything. "The chicken got out," she said.
"Which chicken?"
"The brown one with the bent tail feather. She does it when there's a hole. She finds the holes."
Clara looked at the work he was doing.
"That's the hole. You're fixing it."
"That's the plan."
"Good."
She sat down in the snow without concern for her dress and watched him work.
"Are you going to take our house?"
Cole kept nailing. "Your mother and I made an arrangement."
"That means maybe."
He stopped and looked at her. 6 years old, braids coming loose, snow on her hem, watching him with eyes that had decided to take him at face value until he proved otherwise. There was something bracing about it, the absence of adult strategy, just a child asking a direct question and waiting for a direct answer. "It means your mother has until February 1st to pay the debt," Cole said. "If she can do that, you keep the house. If she can't, we'll have a harder problem to solve." Clara thought about this with visible seriousness.
"Can she?"
"I think she can."
"You don't know her yet," Clara said. "Mama does things everybody thinks she can't. Papa used to say she was the most stubborn woman in Montana Territory."
She looked down at her stuffed cat,
adjusted its remaining 3 legs. He meant it like a compliment. It sounds like one. Mr. Harrington, Clara looked up. Nora likes you. She told me at lunch. She said you have honest eyes. She delivered this as information, no more emotionally weighted than reporting the weather. Nora is almost never wrong about people. She was wrong about Mr. Deakins from the feed store, but that's because he gives us extra oats sometimes, so she thinks he's good. But really, he's just trying to get Mama to like him, which Mama doesn't, but she's polite about it. Cole looked at this 6-year-old for a moment. Your family is very observant. Mama says it's because we don't have money, so we have to pay attention instead. Clara stood up and brushed snow off her dress, with the business-like efficiency she seemed to apply to everything. Supper's almost ready. Mama says you should come eat with us since you fixed the coop and the fence and the cellar door. She turned to walk away. Stopped. She also said to tell you it wasn't an obligation, just an invitation, and you could say no if you wanted. She turned back, very serious. But I think you should say yes. Henry won't like it, but Ruth thinks it's the right thing to do, and Nora already set a place for you. Cole looked at the half-finished repair in his hands, then at the small girl standing in the snow, waiting for his answer with perfect patience. Tell your mother I'll be in shortly, he said. Clara nodded, satisfied, and went around the corner of the house. Cole drove the last nail into the coop roof and stood in the cold and looked at the pale winter sky going gold at the edges as the sun dropped west. Somewhere behind him, miles away through the snow, a man named Decker Hoyle was sitting in a saloon, recalculating his approach to a problem he thought he had arranged neatly. Cole rolled that thought over and looked at the shape of it, at what it meant that a man had engineered a widow's destruction from the outside and used Cole as the instrument, without Cole ever knowing he was being used. He did not like the shape of it at all. He went inside for supper. The table was loud, in the way that tables were loud when children had been indoors all day in the cold, and finally had somewhere to put their energy. Clara talked without stopping. Thomas threw a piece of bread that hit Henry in the ear, which Henry accepted with the long-suffering tolerance of a boy who had learned that retaliating against the baby was not worth what it cost. Nora ate quietly and watched Cole from across the table with those enormous brown eyes. And every time he looked at her, she looked away, and then immediately looked back. Ruth served the food with quiet competence, moving between the kitchen and the table like a small adult, and Agnes managed the chaos of it with the practiced ease of a woman who had stopped fighting the noise and started moving through it. Cole sat at the end of the table and ate beef stew that was thin on the beef and thick on the root vegetables, and tasted like something made with real care out of limited resources. And he didn't say very much, just answered when he was spoken to, which Clara ensured happened regularly. Near the end of the meal, Henry said, without looking up from his plate, "The fence post on the east corner. You set it deeper than it was before." Frost heave had worked it loose, Cole said. Deeper sets hold better through the freeze-thaw. Henry was quiet for a moment. Papa didn't know that. I'll know it now. He picked up his fork again. Thanks. Agnes looked at Cole across the table. Just looked at him, for one brief second, with something in her face that wasn't gratitude exactly, and wasn't anything he could name quickly enough before she looked away. After supper, after the children were put to bed with a particular organized tenderness Agnes brought to it, reading to the little ones while Ruth settled the baby, Henry taking himself to bed without being asked, the house went quiet. Cole put on his coat to leave. Mr. Harrington. Agnes was at the kitchen table with a candle, a needle, and a pile of mending that was going to take hours. She didn't look up from it. Decker Hoyle came to see Will last winter, offered to buy this property. Will said no. The needle moved through the fabric, steady. Will never told me why the offer made him uneasy. He just said, "A man who wants your water
more than your land, is a man to watch." Cole went still. She looked up then, and her brown eyes in the candlelight were steady and knowing. "Whatever Wade told you in the barn today, I'd appreciate it if you told me directly. I'm not fragile, and this is my family's future we're discussing." The candle between them threw warm light on the cold walls and the careful mending in her hands and the absolutely unflinching set of her jaw. Cole sat back down. "All right," he said. "Here's what I know." He told her everything. All of it, the way Wade had laid it out in the barn, Hoyle's plan, the engineered loan, the water rights, the fact that Will had been steered toward Cole's lending operation by design rather than circumstance. He told it straight, without softening it, because she'd asked him to, and because he'd understood in the first 5 minutes of knowing Agnes Calloway that softening things for her was not a service she wanted. She listened without interrupting. The needle kept moving through the fabric while he talked, steady and even, and her face stayed composed in the way of someone who had learned to receive bad news without letting it knock her off her feet immediately. She needed to stay upright first. She could fall apart later, privately, after the children were asleep and nobody could see. When he finished, she set the mending down. "He used Will," she said. Not a question, just the shape of it, out loud, being examined. "He used Will's situation. There's a difference." "Is there?" She said it flat, no inflection, which was worse than anger would have been. "Will was struggling. Will was desperate, and too proud to ask me for help and trying to fix things quietly before I noticed how bad they'd gotten. Hoyle found that and used it like a tool." She was quiet for a moment. "Will walked right into it because he was exactly the kind of man a predator looks for. Earnest, proud, in trouble. Yes. And now Hoyle is sitting in town, waiting for the mechanism to finish working." She picked the mending back up. The needle went in. "Except the mechanism decided to give me 60 days. "I'm riding into town tomorrow morning," Cole said. "I'm going to make clear to Hoyle that whatever arrangement he thought he'd constructed has changed." Agnes looked up at him. "And you think he'll accept that?" "I think he'll understand that I'm aware of what he did, which changes his position considerably. A man who operates by manipulating situations from a distance doesn't generally want those situations made public." "You think he'll back down?" "I think he'll recalculate." Cole paused. "That's not the same as backing down. A man like Hoyle doesn't stop wanting the thing he wants. He just finds different angles." Agnes was quiet, the needle moving. Outside, the wind had picked back up, not the violence of the night before, but steady, pressing against the walls like something that intended to outlast them. "Mr. Harrington." She said his name the way she'd been saying it, deliberate, giving it weight. "Why are you doing this? You came here to collect a debt. You gave me 60 days, which I did not expect and I'm grateful for. But this—" She gestured between them, at the table, at the conversation they'd just had. "This goes past a business decision." Cole looked at his hands on the table. "Hoyle manipulated my operation to serve his purposes. That makes it my business." "That's a clean answer." "It's the true one." She looked at him for a long moment, with those steady brown eyes that had a way of seeing past the surface of things, whether he wanted them to or not. "All right," she said finally. She didn't push further. She just picked up the mending and kept working, and Cole understood that she'd filed his answer somewhere and would return to it later. He stood to leave, got as far as his coat. "Cole." She used his name for the first time, without ceremony, like she'd been deciding whether to and had decided. He stopped. "Be careful with Hoyle." Men who build traps for other people don't usually appreciate having the trap explained to them. He looked back at her, at the single candle, at the mending in her hands, at the way she held herself straight at the end of a day that had been hard from before sunrise. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Calloway," he said. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "Agnes," she said, "if we're past formalities."
He put his hat on and walked out into the dark. He rode into Sweetgrass the next morning before most of the town was awake, Wade alongside him. Carson left at the Calloway property with instructions to stay visible and stay alert. The road had been broken by a freight wagon sometime in the night, rutted and icy, but passable, and Cole rode it without talking, the cold working at his face and his mind working at the conversation ahead. Decker Hoyle's saloon sat at the north end of the main street, the largest building in Sweetgrass besides the livery. 2 stories, painted dark red, the paint starting to peel at the corners. Hoyle had money, and he spent it on the appearance of having money, rather than on the reality of it, which told Cole something about the man's relationship with what was real. Hoyle was behind the bar when Cole walked in, stacking glasses with the methodical attention of a man who needed his hands busy while his mind worked. He was 50-something, built wide through the chest, with a face that had once been handsome and now just looked like it had gotten everything it wanted for 20 years and was starting to suspect that wasn't enough. He looked up when Cole came through the door, and his face did something careful and controlled. "Harrington, didn't expect you in town. Thought you'd be out at the Calloway place, collecting your deed." "Sit down, Decker." Hoyle's jaw tightened. He was a man accustomed to being the one who set the terms of a conversation. He set the glass down slowly and came around the bar and sat at the nearest table. And Cole sat across from him, and Wade stood at the door, and the 3 of them were the only people in the saloon at 7 in the morning. "I know what you did," Cole said. He kept his voice even, almost conversational. He'd found over the years that calm was more frightening than anger to men who were used to intimidating people. "I know you pointed Will Calloway in my direction. I know you've been buying up distressed notes in this valley for 2 years, with the specific intention of controlling water access on the South Fork. I know this property was the last piece you needed, and you used my lending operation as the mechanism to acquire it." Hoyle looked at him with the flat attention of a man calculating options. "You can't prove any of that. I don't need to prove it in court. I need to say it out loud to the right people." Cole leaned forward slightly. "You used me, Decker. You used my name and my legal standing to do something I would never have agreed to if you'd asked me directly. That's a problem." "I didn't ask you to do anything. The man borrowed money and signed a contract. What you did with that contract was your business. Except you designed the situation. You picked the borrower, you pointed him at me. You knew the timeline. You knew the widow would be alone in December, and you were waiting for me to hand you the deed so you could buy it for cents on the dollar." Cole's voice stayed level. "That's not just good business, Decker. That's predatory. And when people in this valley understand what you've been doing, your ability to operate here ends." Hoyle's eyes went hard. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand that the Calloway property is no longer part of your calculation. The widow has 60 days to bring in her wheat and pay the debt. If she does, she keeps the land. If she doesn't, the deed reverts to me, and I will sell it to whoever I choose." Cole held his gaze. "It will not be you." A silence that had edges to it. "That property controls the only year-round water source on the South Fork," Hoyle said, his voice dropping into something quieter and more dangerous. "I've spent 2 years building toward it." "I know. You'd cut off your nose to spite me. I'd sell a piece of land to someone who'll use it to farm, which is what it's for." Cole stood up. "Stay away from Agnes Calloway, Decker. Stay away from her property.
her children, her arrangements in town. If I hear you've interfered with her operation in any way, I'll make what you've been doing in this valley very public and very loud." Hoyle looked up at him from the table, and Cole could see the recalculating happening in real time behind his eyes. The angles being considered and discarded, the assessment of risk and leverage, and what moves were left. It was the look of a chess player who'd had the board flipped and was deciding whether to start a new game or knock the whole table over. "You're making an enemy," Hoyle said. "I've had enemies before." Cole picked up his hat. "They didn't stop me from anything that mattered." He walked out. Wade fell into step beside him on the boardwalk, and they untied their horses from the rail and mounted up. And Wade kept his silence all the way to the edge of town before he said, "He's going to move faster now, you know. Backed into a corner, men always move faster." "I know. So what's the play?" Cole looked north, toward the road that led back through the snow to a farmhouse with 5 children and a woman who was probably already up doing the work of 3 people before sunrise. "We give her what she needs to get that wheat in," he said, "and we make sure Hoyle doesn't touch it." The days that followed settled into a rhythm that Cole had not anticipated and did not entirely know what to do with. He'd intended to stay 2 days, inspect the wheat, make his position with Hoyle clear, ride back to his operation in Billings with the extension documented and his investment secured. That had been the plan. The plan had not accounted for the fence line on the Calloway property's north boundary being in worse shape than the east side, or for the fact that the woodpile he'd stacked needed restacking after a section of it collapsed in the night, or for the root cellar door hinge he'd replaced needing a second adjustment because the first screw he'd used was too short for the frozen wood. There was always something. He told himself that each morning, and each morning it was true, and each morning he stayed. Agnes did not ask him to stay. She also did not ask him to leave. She worked from before dawn to after dark, and she let him work alongside her without making it into anything, treating him with the practical directness she apparently brought to everything, asking for help when she needed it, accepting it when he offered, and the two of them moving through the days with the careful efficiency of people who had figured out that they could accomplish more without overthinking the arrangement. It was Henry who changed. Not dramatically, not all at once. Henry didn't do things dramatically. He did them the way his mother did, with a quiet deliberateness that meant the change had already happened inside before it showed on the surface. It started on the 4th day, when Cole was checking the wheat fields again, and Henry appeared at the edge of the snow and stood watching. Cole didn't call to him, just worked. After a while, Henry walked out and crouched down and looked at what Cole was looking at. The stubble under the snow. The quality of the root structure. "Is it going to be enough?" Henry asked. "Should be. Good root depth. Your father knew what he was doing when he picked the seed variety." Henry was quiet for a moment. He read about it, in the farming almanac. He'd read the almanac every winter, and then talk about what he was going to try in spring. He pulled a piece of frozen stubble from the ground and turned it in his fingers. He was better at reading about farming than doing it, mostly. But this one he got right. "It counts," Cole said. "Does it? Getting one thing right?" Cole looked at the boy. 8 years old, carrying a question that men 3 times his age hadn't figured out how to answer. "It counts more than getting nothing right," he said. "And the people who love you remember the things you got right. The rest fades." Henry turned the stubble piece over in his fingers one more time, then set it down carefully, like he was putting something back where it belonged. He stood up. "I can show you where the drainage ditch is, on the south end. Papa dug it in the fall. It'll matter when the thaw comes." "Show me," Cole said. They spent an hour in the fields together, Henry explaining what Will had planned and where and why, with the particular precision of a child who had paid close attention, because he understood that this information might be important someday. And now, someday had arrived faster than anyone had intended. On the fifth evening, Reverend Birch rode out from town. He was 60 years old, Thomas Birch, lean and white-haired, riding a horse that was almost as old as he was, and moved through the snow with the patient dignity of a creature that had decided comfort was overrated.
He came to the front door, and Agnes let him in without surprise, as if she'd been expecting him. And Cole found out later that she'd sent Ruth to town with a note 2 days ago, which told him she'd been thinking several steps ahead about what Hoyle might do next. Birch sat at the table and drank Agnes's coffee, and looked at Cole with the calm assessment of a man who had spent 40 years watching humans make decisions, and had developed strong opinions about which kinds were worth making. "Decker Hoyle," Birch said, "has been to see Sheriff Aldrich. He's suggesting there are irregularities in the loan extension you granted Mrs. Calloway. He's implying that your judgment was compromised by personal interest, and that the extension may not be legally binding." Agnes set her cup down carefully. "He can't do that." "He can't undo a properly witnessed contract," Cole said, "which is why I had it filed with the county clerk the morning after we signed it." Birch nodded slowly. "Good. Then his legal options are limited." He folded his hands on the table. "His other options are less limited. He has 3 men who work for him, not cowhands, men he brought up from Billings 2 years ago, whose previous employment I've heard various accounts of, none of them reassuring." He looked at Agnes. "I don't think he'll move against you directly. Too visible, too many people watching now. But the wheat, when it's ready, when you're trying to bring it in—" "He'd interfere with the harvest," Cole said. "He'd find a way to make it fail. Equipment that breaks at the wrong moment, day labor that doesn't show up, weather that might be waited out or might not, and a man in your position making the decision about whether it's safe to cut." Birch looked at Cole steadily. "He doesn't need you to fail completely. He just needs the wheat to miss the deadline." The candle between them burned in the draft from the window, throwing unsteady light across 3 faces that were all arriving at the same understanding from different directions. Agnes stood up and walked to the window and stood with her back to them for a moment, looking out at the dark. When she turned around, her face had the quality Cole had seen on it before, the specific expression of a woman who has processed something difficult and is already 3 steps into what to do about it. "I need more than 60 days, she said. "I need the right 60 days. I need to be ready to cut the wheat the exact moment the thaw allows it, and have enough hands on the property that Hoyle can't touch the operation without doing it openly." She looked at Cole. "That means I need help I don't have, and resources I haven't got. And I'm asking you directly because I'm done pretending I can do this alone." The room was quiet. Birch looked at his coffee cup with the expression of a man who was not going to say anything until it was time to say something, and seemed to know the difference. Cole looked at Agnes standing in the candlelight with 5 children asleep down the hall, and 40 acres of winter wheat under the snow outside, and a man in town trying to take all of it, and he felt the thing he'd been keeping at arm's length for 5 days settle into his chest with a weight that was not unpleasant and not safe, and was not going to move now that it had landed. "Tell me what you need," he said. Agnes held his gaze. "I need you to stay." The word hung in the cold air of that kitchen, simple and direct, the way she said everything. And it meant exactly what it said, and probably more than either of them was ready to examine yet. "All right," Cole said. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, and the snow shifted and settled. And somewhere down the hall, Thomas made a small sound in his sleep and went quiet again. And the candle burned steady between them. Staying meant something different than Cole had anticipated. He'd thought of it practically, the way he thought of most things, as a logistical arrangement with a defined purpose. He would be present on the property through the thaw and the harvest. He would ensure Hoyle had no opportunity to interfere without doing so openly. He would protect his investment, and Agnes would bring in the wheat and pay the debt, and the arrangement would conclude cleanly. That was the shape he'd given it in his mind. What it actually was this. Waking before dawn every morning to the sound of Agnes already moving in the kitchen, the smell of coffee already on, and finding that the day had a different quality when it began alongside someone else's purpose, instead of only his own. It was Henry, appearing at the wheat fields every afternoon without being asked, working beside Cole in the cold with the focused silence of a boy who was learning things he knew he needed to know. It was Clara's running commentary on everything, delivered without pause or apparent need for response, a constant warm noise at the edge of whatever he was doing. It was Nora, who had decided somewhere in the second week that Cole's left side was her preferred location during the evening meal, appearing beside him at the table each night and climbing onto the bench next to him with the serene confidence of someone exercising a right they'd already established. It was Thomas, 18 months old and indifferent to the complexity of adult situations, who had taken to pulling himself upright, using Cole's boot as a handhold whenever Cole sat still long enough, and who had recently learned to say a sound that was not quite a word, but was directed specifically at Cole and nobody else, and which Cole did not examine too closely, because examining it would require him to have feelings about it, and he was already having more feelings than he'd budgeted for. 3 weeks into January, the weather broke open for 4 days, temperatures climbing enough to make the snow heavy and wet, and the roads into town passable again. Cole rode in on the second day with Wade, ostensibly to check on business correspondence that had been waiting in Billings, actually to take the measure of how Hoyle was moving. What he found was worse than he'd expected and more specific. Hoyle had been busy. He'd spoken to the 3 men who ran the only threshing equipment in the valley, a family operation out of the Hendricks place, and made them an offer Cole couldn't immediately counter because he didn't know the terms. He'd also had a conversation with the day laborers who typically hired out for harvest work in the valley. 6 men who came every spring from the east looking for seasonal work. And something had been said that had made 2 of them already commit elsewhere. And he'd filed a formal complaint with the county land board, not actionable yet, not specific enough to be actionable, but the kind of thing that created paperwork and process and delay at exactly the wrong moment. He was not attacking directly. He was removing the pieces Agnes would need when the time came. Wade laid it out on the ride back, methodical, the way Wade did things. He doesn't need the harvest to fail outright. He just needs it to be late, miss the February 1st deadline by even a week, and the contract gives him the opening to contest the extension. He's got a cousin on the land board who'll drag the process out long enough to be ruinous. I know, Cole said. So we need threshers she can count on, and hands she can count on, before Hoyle locks them all up. I know that too. You got a plan, boss, or are we improvising? Cole was quiet for a long stretch of road. Both, he said. He told Agnes that evening, at the kitchen table, after the children were in bed, which had become the hour they talked, the one reliable quiet in the day. She listened with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and her face doing that thing it did when she was processing information and deciding simultaneously what to do about it. The Hendricks family, she said, when he finished. Ed Hendricks. He and Will didn't always get along. They had a dispute over the fence line on the east boundary 3 years ago, and it didn't end cleanly. But his wife Sarah and I have been friends since before the children were born. I can talk to Sarah. Hoyle got there first. Hoyle offered money. Sarah Hendricks has known me for 9 years. She looked at him. That's a different currency. She rode to the Hendricks place the next morning, 6 miles through the snow, taking Ruth with her
and leaving Henry in charge of the younger ones with Cole on the property. She was gone 4 hours. She came back with Ed Hendricks' handshake agreement to bring his equipment to the Calloway fields on whatever day the wheat was ready. The fence dispute apparently having been reopened and resolved in the time Agnes had been drinking coffee with Sarah in their kitchen. Cole looked at her when she came in, snow on her coat, cold in her cheeks, something quietly satisfied in the set of her mouth.
"How?" he said. "I told Ed the truth, that Decker Hoyle had spent 2 years engineering the destruction of my family's livelihood, and that if he helped Hoyle do it, he'd be the kind of man his children would hear about when they were old enough to understand what had happened here." She pulled off her gloves. "Ed Hendricks is not a bad man. He just needed someone to say out loud what kind of decision he was making." Cole thought about that for a moment. "You're very good at that." "At what?" "Saying the true thing plainly and letting it do the work." Agnes looked at him for a moment, and something moved through her face that was not the composed practicality she showed most of the time. Something more unguarded. "Will used to say I had no patience for going around things." She paused. "He meant it as a criticism mostly. But he also said it with a kind of relief, I think. Like it was easier to be near someone who didn't make you guess." Cole said nothing, but he understood what she meant, and he understood that she'd told him something real about her marriage in those 2 sentences. Something more honest than most people managed in years of conversation. And he filed it in the place where he was keeping all the true things Agnes Calloway said without intending to keep them. The thaw came back 10 days later, hard and fast, the way Montana thaws came. The temperature climbing 20 degrees in 2 days, the snow going heavy and wet before it started to pull back from the fields. Cole had been watching the wheat since dawn, walking the rows, checking the ground, waiting for the moment when the soil was workable and the stalks were right. It came on a Thursday. He went to the house and knocked on the back door, and Agnes opened it, already dressed for field work, as if she'd been waiting. "Today?" she said. "Today." She turned back into the house, and her voice changed into the one she used for organizing the children, clear and fast, and brooking nothing. Ruth was given charge of Thomas and Nora. Henry was told to ride to the Hendricks place and tell Ed it was time. Clara was given a list of tasks in the kitchen that would keep her busy and safe. Agnes was ready to walk out the door in 4 minutes. Ed Hendricks arrived with his equipment and 2 of his own hands by mid-morning. The day laborers Cole had quietly contracted 3 days ago, bypassing Hoyle entirely by riding to find them himself, showed up an hour later. Wade and Carson had been on the property since dawn. They cut wheat from first light to last, and Agnes was in the field the entire time, working alongside the men without apology or explanation, doing what needed doing, and the wheat came down in clean rows under a sky that stayed cold and clear and cooperated for once. It was on the second day of cutting that Hoyle moved. Cole heard the horses before he saw them, looked up from the south end of the field, and counted 4 riders coming in from the east road. Not Hoyle himself. Hoyle was not that kind of man. But the 3 men Wade had mentioned, the ones from Billings, and a 4th Cole didn't recognize. All of them riding with a particular purposefulness that said they had a job and a deadline. He walked to meet them before they reached the field, putting himself between the riders and the operation behind him. Wade came up on his left without being called. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man with a flat expression and a rifle across his saddle, reined up 10 feet from Cole. "Mr. Hoyle has a legal interest in this property. We're here to observe the harvest operation and ensure no irregularities in the process." "You're here to interfere," Cole said. "We're here to observe. This is private property, and you're trespassing. You have 2 minutes to turn around." The man looked at Cole with the flat assessment of someone calculating whether the obstacle in front of him was the kind that moved or the kind that didn't. "Mr. Hoyle believes the extension on this note may not be legally binding. Until that matter is resolved by the county land board, The extension is filed with the county clerk, witnessed by Reverend Thomas Birch and 2 additional parties, and executed under standard contract law in the territory of Montana. Cole kept his voice even. The land board complaint Hoyle filed last week has no bearing on a valid contract's execution. You know that. Whoever told you to come here knows that. He took 1 step forward. So what I'm telling you is that those 2 minutes are running. The man held his position for 10 seconds, looked at Wade, who had not moved or said anything, but was present in the specific way that Wade was present when something might need to happen quickly. Looked at the field behind Cole, where Ed Hendricks's equipment was still moving, and the hands were still cutting, and Agnes Calloway was working a row that nobody had stopped. Then he looked back at Cole. Mr. Hoyle isn't finished with this matter. Mr. Hoyle is welcome to pursue legal remedies through proper channels, Cole said. Right now, get off this property. They left. Cole watched them go until they were over the rise, then turned back to the field and found Henry standing 6 feet behind him, still holding the water pail he'd been carrying to the hands. The boy had watched the whole thing without saying a word. "They'll come back," Henry said. "Maybe." "What do we do if they come back with more men?" Cole looked at him. 8 years old, the hat brim bent just so, Will's eyes in a face that was already showing the angles it would have when he was grown. "We make sure there's nothing to come back for," Cole said. "We get this wheat in today." Henry nodded once, the way his mother nodded, decisive, no wasted motion. "I'll take water to the south row." He turned and went. They finished cutting by 4 in the afternoon, an hour before the light went. Ed Hendricks shook Cole's hand and then Agnes's, and his wife Sarah had come with him and embraced Agnes in the field with the particular warmth of women who had been each other's witnesses through hard things. And the hands were paid and thanked and started the ride back to wherever they'd come from. And the Calloway wheat stood cut and waiting to be threshed. The threshing took 2 more days. On the evening of the second day, with the wheat in and the count done, and the number written on a piece of paper that Tom Pritchard from the grain elevator had ridden out to provide, Agnes sat at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. $480 at current market rate, with the remaining crop to be sold once it was hauled to the elevator. More than enough. She'd known it would be. She'd planted that certainty like a second crop alongside the wheat itself. Tended it through December and January. Refused to let it fail, even when everything around it was trying to make it. The children were still awake, because the end of a harvest was a thing to mark even if you were 6 or 4 or 18 months old and didn't fully understand what had been at stake. Ruth had made cornbread. Clara had appointed herself in charge of the celebration, which meant she talked for 40 minutes straight about everything she was going to do now that the farm was saved. Several of which plans involved a pony, which Agnes addressed with patient firmness. Henry sat at the end of the table and didn't say much, but kept looking at Cole with an expression that was working its way toward something he hadn't finished deciding yet. Nora climbed into Cole's lap after supper without asking, the way she'd been doing for 2 weeks, and put her head against his chest and went most of the way to sleep while Clara was still talking about the pony. And Cole sat with one hand against her back and felt the weight of her, small and warm and completely trusting, and did not think about Eleanor or 7 years of walls built against exactly this. He thought about Will Calloway planting wheat in October in frozen ground, and understood something about it that he hadn't before. Not foolishness, not even just bravery, something more specific. The knowledge that the things you do for the people you love don't stop mattering because you're gone. They come up in the spring, and they feed your children, and they prove, in the most practical possible way, that you are here and you were trying. Agnes was watching him. She did that sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, and he'd noticed it the way he'd noticed most things about her, quietly, without making it into something that required a response. He looked back. The children between them and the candle on the table and the cornbread and the piece of paper with the number on it that meant the house was safe. All of it held in the particular stillness of a moment that knows it's a turning point, before the people in it have said a word. "I need to tell you something," Cole said. Agnes folded her hands on the table. "All right?" He said it the way he'd never said it to anyone, not in the years since Eleanor, not in the careful, solitary life he'd built on the principle that honesty was the same as exposure and exposure was the same as danger. He said it because Agnes Calloway had spent 3 months teaching him by example that keeping things inside until they rotted was not the same as being strong, and because the children were here, and the wheat was in, and Hoyle had been face down, and there was nothing left to hide behind. "I came here in December to collect a debt," he said. "I told myself the extension was a business decision. I told myself staying was about protecting the investment. I told myself every version of a lie that a man tells himself when he's doing something his reasons don't fully explain." He looked at her steadily. "The truth is that I stopped thinking about this as a transaction somewhere around the time Henry brought me coffee at 5 in the morning and told me where his mother kept the sugar." Agnes was very still. "I have been alone for 7 years because I decided that being alone was the same as being safe," Cole said. "And I built a life that was successful and quiet and entirely without risk. And it was the most hollowed-out way of living I can imagine. And I didn't understand that until I was sitting in a barn in a blizzard, listening to your house be alive on the other side of a snowstorm." He paused. "I'm not good at this. I should tell you that plainly. I'm not practiced at it, and I'll get things wrong. And I have more edges than a man your children should be around probably ought to have. But I'm asking you, Agnes, to let me try." The candle moved in the draft. Nora shifted in his lap, sighed, went back to sleep. Agnes looked at him across the table with those steady brown eyes that had seen through every version of him since December, and had not looked away from any of it. Not the hardness, not the calculating distance. Not the man who had ridden out here to take her house, and the man who had stayed to save it. Both of them real. Both of them his. "You fixed the fence," she said. Cole blinked. "What?" "The fence post, on the east corner. You set it deeper than it needed to be. You didn't have to do that. It wasn't part of any arrangement. You just did it because it needed doing." She looked at him steadily. "That's who you are, Cole. Not the man who came in December. Not the man who made himself hard so nothing could touch him. The man who sets fence posts deeper than they need to be, because he can't walk past a thing that's wrong and leave it wrong." She paused. "That man I already trust." The word trust, said plainly, landing in the specific space it was meant for, in the place he'd been guarding for 7 years against exactly this. Henry, at the end of the table, was looking at his cornbread with great concentration. Ruth was looking at the ceiling. Clara had, against all probability, stopped talking. "So," Agnes said. "Yes." Cole looked at her. "Yes to what specifically? I didn't ask a question." "You asked several questions. You just didn't phrase them that way." Something moved in her face that was warm and certain, and a little bit like the expression she had when she'd already solved the problem, before anyone else in the room knew there was one to solve. "The answer is yes." From the end of the table, Henry put his cornbread down and said, without looking up, "It's about time." Ruth made a sound that might have been agreement. Clara started talking about the pony again. Thomas, from his cradle in the corner, made a noise that was either commentary or digestion. And Nora slept on in Cole's arms, entirely undisturbed by the fact that the world had just shifted. The yes hung in the air of that kitchen for about 4 seconds,
before Clara remembered she had opinions about weddings. "Will there be cake?" she asked.
Because Ruth makes good cake when we have enough flour. And Mama, we should have enough flour now that we're not poor anymore, right? And can I wear my blue dress even though it has the torn hem because I like it better than the brown one, and the brown one makes me look like a potato? Henry said so.
"Henry," Agnes said. "I said it kindly," Henry said, still looking at his cornbread. "You did not say it kindly." "I said it honestly. There's a difference." "There is not always a difference between those two things, and you know it." Cole looked at Agnes across the table, and Agnes looked back at Cole. And the thing that happened between them in that moment was not dramatic or cinematic, or the kind of thing that would make a story by itself. It was simpler than that. It was two people catching each other's eyes in the middle of the ordinary chaos of a family, and recognizing without words that this was the thing. Not the big moments. This.
The cornbread and the torn hem, and the child who said honest things that weren't always kind. This was what it was going to be, and both of them were choosing it with full knowledge of that fact, and neither of them looked away. Reverend Birch came out 3 days later, at Agnes's request and Cole's, and married them in the front room of the Calloway house, with the children as witnesses, and Wade standing at the back with his hat in his hands, looking like a man attending the resolution of something he'd been watching develop for longer than anyone had admitted it was developing. There was no ring immediately. Cole had not had time to get to a proper jeweler in Billings, and he'd said so plainly the night before, half apology. And Agnes had said, equally plainly, that she'd been wearing Will's ring for 6 years, and a ring was not the thing she was marrying him for. She'd taken Will's ring off that morning and put it in the small wooden box where she kept things that mattered and needed to be kept carefully. And she'd stood at the kitchen counter for a moment with her hand empty and her expression doing something private that Cole had not intruded on. When Birch said the words and it was done, Henry shook Cole's hand. He did it formally, the way a man did it, and Cole took his hand and shook it the same way, and neither of them said anything because the handshake said it. Ruth hugged Agnes, and then, after a moment of visible deliberation, hugged Cole too, briefly, and with the controlled dignity of a 10-year-old who was not going to cry about this in front of anyone. Clara hugged everyone in the room, including Wade, who accepted it with stoic grace. Nora climbed Cole's leg until he picked her up and then put both arms around his neck and stayed there through the rest of the afternoon. Thomas ate a piece of cornbread that was mostly Ruth's cornbread and partly the table, which he was also eating, and was removed from the table twice. Birch stayed for coffee and then rode back to town, and Wade took Carson and rode back to Billings to manage the operation there, pausing at the door long enough to look at Cole, with 16 years of knowing him compressed into one expression that said everything he wasn't going to say out loud. "Boss," he said. "Wade, you look different." "I'm the same." "You look different," Wade said again, and put his hat on and left. The house that evening had a different quality than it had before. Not louder, not more settled, but different in the way a room is different when a window that has been shut for a long time is opened. Something was moving through it that hadn't been moving before. Cole felt it most when he was helping Henry with his reading after supper, sitting at the table with the lamp between them, and Henry's finger moving under the words with the effortful concentration of a boy who was good at many things and had decided he was going to be good at this too. And Agnes was putting the little ones to bed, and her voice was coming down the hall, low and familiar, the specific register she used when she was reading to them. And the house was warm, and outside was Montana in February, doing everything February in Montana did. And Cole sat at that table and felt the weight of 7 years lifting off him, the way snow came off a roof when the thaw finally arrived. Not all at once, in pieces, slide by slide. He'd written to his solicitor in Billings the morning after the harvest, instructing that the remaining balance of the Calloway debt be marked satisfied in full. Agnes had found out when the letter came back confirmed, and had stood in the kitchen with the paper in her hand and turned to Cole with an expression that was not gratitude, because she'd already told him she didn't want that. "That wasn't part of the arrangement," she said. "The arrangement changed. Cole, I'm not doing it because you need charity. I'm doing it because you're my wife, and the debt is to me, and there's no version of that situation where I collect from you and call it a marriage." He'd looked at her steadily. "The wheat paid Ed Hendricks for the threshing. It covers the cost of the hands, and Birch's fee, and 3 months of household supplies. You earned that, Agnes, every row of it." He paused. "Let me do this one thing." She'd looked at him for a long moment. Then she'd folded the letter and put it in the wooden box with Will's ring, and she hadn't said anything else about it. Decker Hoyle made his last move in the 3rd week of February. It was not the move Cole had been watching for, which was part of why it landed the way it did. He'd been expecting another legal maneuver, another approach through the land board, another attempt to tie up the contract in process and delay. He'd been watching the road and the legal channels and the official mechanisms, which was what Hoyle wanted him to watch. What Hoyle actually did was send one man, alone, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Cole had ridden to the Hendricks place to return the borrowed equipment, and Agnes was at the house with the children. Agnes saw him coming while he was still at the property line, because Agnes saw everything that came toward her house, and she went to the door and waited with Will's rifle at her side. The man was not one of the 3 from Billings. He was older, dressed like a working cowhand, with a face that had no particular menace in it, but a careful watchfulness that said he'd been given specific instructions and intended to follow them. He stopped at the edge of the yard. "Mrs. Harrington." He used the new name deliberately. "Mr. Hoyle wants you to know the land board complaint hasn't been withdrawn. He says regardless of the debt being satisfied, there are questions about the validity of the original extension that are still pending, and in his view, the matter of the property isn't closed." Agnes stood in the doorway and looked at him. "Tell Mr. Hoyle," she said, "that I've spoken with Judge Warren in Billings, who is a personal friend of my husband's, and who has reviewed the extension contract and confirmed its full validity under territorial law. Tell him that Reverend Birch has written a formal letter to the land board attesting to the circumstances of the original loan and the manipulation involved in its creation, which letter is now part of the official record. Tell him that Ed Hendricks has made a similar statement." She paused. "And tell him that my husband knows all of this already, because I told him last night. And if Mr. Hoyle proceeds with any further action against this family, he will be doing so against Cole Harrington directly, and he already knows what that means." The man looked at her for a moment. "That's a lot to remember, ma'am." "I'll write it down if you need." He almost smiled. "No, ma'am, I got it." He touched his hat brim and turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Henry was standing behind Agnes when she turned around. He'd been there the whole time. "You knew about Judge Warren?" he said. "I wrote to him 2 weeks ago," Agnes said. "Before the harvest, before the wedding, before any of it was settled. Because your father taught me that you plant things before you need them, not after." Henry looked at her for a long moment. "Mama," he said, and his voice had something in it that was not quite a boy's voice anymore, and not yet a man's, the register that existed between the two for a specific short time. "You're really something." Agnes put her hand on the side of his face briefly, quickly, the way she did it when she didn't want to embarrass him. "Go finish your reading," she said. He went, and she stood in the doorway for a moment longer, and when Cole rode in an hour later,
She was at the fence, watching for him, and he could tell from her face that something had happened, and she told him all of it, standing in the cold, with her coat unbuttoned, because she hadn't stopped to button it before coming out. When she finished, he looked at her for a long moment. "Judge Warren," he said. He and Will served together for 2 years before Will came west. He'd written me after the funeral. I wrote back in January. "You didn't tell me. You had enough to manage." She looked at him directly. "I told you I wasn't going to sit still for 60 days. I meant it about every front." Cole thought about saying several things. Settled on, "I married the right woman." Agnes looked at him with that expression that was not quite a smile, and was headed somewhere past it. "Yes," she said, "you did." Hoyle withdrew the land board complaint 4 days later, without explanation or announcement. Cole heard about it through his solicitor in Billings, a single line in a letter that mentioned it in passing, as if it had been a minor procedural matter rather than 2 months of carefully constructed obstruction. The water rights on the South Fork remained divided, and the Calloway Properties Creek continued to run where it had always run, free and accessible, which was the only outcome that had ever mattered. The spring came in March, fast and certain, the way Montana springs sometimes came after a hard winter, as if the land itself had decided that enough was enough. The wheat fields that Will had planted in October came up green and strong, and Cole stood at the edge of them one morning with Henry beside him, and looked at what a dying man's faith in the future had produced. "Papa would have been pleased," Henry said. "He'd have been more than pleased," Cole said. "He'd have known this was right." Henry was quiet for a moment, looking at the green rose. He'd grown an inch since December, Cole was fairly certain, and the hat that had been 2 sizes too large was starting to fit him. "Mr. Harrington," he said, and then stopped. Cole waited. "Cole," Henry said, correcting himself, trying the word out. "I've been thinking about something. Tell me, the other kids, Clara and Nora and Thomas, they just call you Papa. They started doing it and nobody said to, and they just do." Henry kept his eyes on the wheat. "I didn't do that because I thought it was... I didn't know if it was..." He stopped again, tried again. "My papa is buried under the oak tree, and he's still my papa, and that doesn't change." "No," Cole said, "it doesn't. But you're here, and you've been here every morning before anyone else wakes up doing the work. And you told me the truth about the fence post and the wheat root structure, and why Hoyle was wrong to do what he did, and you didn't make it softer than it was." Henry finally looked at him. "Papa did that too. Told me the truth even when it was hard." Cole said nothing. "So I was thinking," Henry said, "that maybe there's more than one way for a thing to be true at the same time. My papa is my papa. And you could also be..." He paused. "You could also be the other kind." Cole looked at this boy, at the straight back and the careful jaw, and the eyes that had been measuring him since December, with the patient exactness of someone who needed to be certain before they gave anything away. "That would be all right with me," Cole said, "if you decided that." Henry nodded once, looked back at the wheat. "Okay," he said, the way he said everything when the decision was made and the discussion was closed. "I'm going to check the south drainage ditch." He started walking, then looked back once. "Papa would have liked you, I think. He liked men who did what they said they were going to do." He kept walking. Cole stood in the wheat field for a moment after he was gone and did not do anything about the tightness in his chest, except let it be there. The life that settled in around them after that was not a simple life, or a quiet one, because it was a life with 5 children and a working farm and a ranching operation in Billings that required Cole's attention on a rotating basis, and 2 adults who were both accustomed to doing things their own way and were learning, with varying degrees of success, how to be a we instead of two separate I's. They argued sometimes, genuinely, because Agnes was not a woman who backed down from a position she believed in, and Cole was not a man who conceded a point he hadn't been convinced of. And the children treated these arguments with a philosophical acceptance of people who understood that two strong people sharing a life were going to have disagreements, and that the disagreements were not the same as the end of anything. Ruth turned 11 in April, and Cole gave her a proper notebook, the kind with sewn binding and good paper, to replace the battered one she'd been carrying. She looked at it for a moment, and then looked at him with those eyes that saw everything, and said, "Thank you, Cole," in the tone of someone who understood that a gift was a language and had heard what this one was saying. Clara got her pony in May, a small buckskin mare with a white blaze that Clara named Josephine without consulting anyone, which was consistent. She talked to Josephine the same way she talked to everyone, continuously and without apparent need for response. And Josephine seemed to accept this, which told Cole the horse had good character. Nora bloomed that spring in the particular way shy children bloom when they feel safe. Not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, reaching toward the warmth the way the wheat had reached toward the thaw. She started talking more, asking questions in that careful way she had, as if she'd already thought about the question for a long time before she said it out loud. She called Cole Papa from the beginning and never wavered from it, with the certainty of a child who had decided a thing and saw no reason to revisit the decision. Thomas walked in March and talked in April, and by May had opinions about everything he could name, which was growing daily. He was his mother's son in the way he delivered information, plainly and directly, without ornamentation, and his father's son in the way he laughed, which was sudden and whole and took over his entire face. On a Sunday evening in June, with the days long and the fields full, and the children somewhere between asleep and not quite, Cole and Agnes sat on the porch in the warmth that Montana saved for its summer evenings, the particular gold light that made everything look like the first day of something. "Dot McAllister asked me yesterday if I was happy," Agnes said. "What did you tell her?" "I told her yes." She was quiet for a moment. "She said she could see it, said I looked different than I did in December." She turned to look at him. "Do I?" Cole looked at her, at the woman who had pressed a rifle barrel to his chest in a blizzard, and told him he'd have to go through her first. At the woman who had negotiated the terms of her family's survival across a kitchen table while holding an 18-month-old on her hip. At the woman who had planted a letter to Judge Warren in January the way Will had planted wheat in October, in cold ground, before she knew for certain that any of it was going to come up. "Yes," he said. "You look different." "Good different or bad different?" "You look like someone who isn't carrying everything alone anymore." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You look different too." "Do I?" "You look like a man who came in from the cold." She said it simply, no performance in it, just the precise shape of the thing as she saw it. "You look like you remembered what it was for." The light went on across the fields, and the creek ran where it had always run, and somewhere inside the house, a child called out something, and was answered, and went quiet again. And Cole sat on that porch in the June evening, with his wife beside him, and understood, fully and without reservation, that the thing he'd spent 7 years building walls against had not, in the end, destroyed him. It had found him in a blizzard on a Tuesday in December, with a rifle pressed against his chest, and 5 children on the other side of a door, and 40 acres of faith frozen in the ground, and it had made him better than he'd known how to be before it arrived. He'd come to collect a debt, and found something that couldn't be put in a contract, or measured in acres, or held at arm's length with iron rules and careful distance. He'd found what a man was actually for. Not the accumulation, not the protection.
The daily choosing of the people in front of him, the fence posts set deeper than they needed to be, the coffee brought before sunrise, the truth told to a boy who needed it straight. The debt had been paid in full. And what Cole Harrington had in return was not a piece of land or a satisfied ledger. It was this porch, this light, this woman, these 5 children who were his in every way that the word meant anything at all. It was a home that had been built by a man who planted wheat in frozen ground so his children would have something in the spring, and tended by a woman who refused to let it fall, and found, finally, by a man who hadn't known he was looking until he arrived at the door. Some debts you don't collect. Some debts collect you, pull you out of the cold life you've made for yourself and into the warm one you were always supposed to find. And the only thing left to do is recognize it when it happens and have the courage to stay. Cole Harrington stayed, and that made all the difference.